Hey guys, welcome to section 2 of part A. In this section we're going to talk about the strategies in responsive web design. Now there's three basic, pretty much mandatory strategies that I went over very briefly in the last section, and that is fluid and flexible layouts, flexible images, and CSS3 media queries. So these three make up a real responsive website. So we're going to go over each of these just a little bit. So fluid layouts. You can say goodbye to fixed pixel layouts. Fluid layouts are recommended for responsive websites where we let the window or the device determine the width of things like containers, content, and sidebars. We can make columns and elements relative to each other. So we want to use percentages. For instance, if we have a main content area and then we have a sidebar, you may want to make the content area have a width of 70% and the sidebar a width of 30%. And of course those numbers will be different depending on your margins and paddings, but that's just a basic example. So let's take a look at an image. So here we have a header which spans 90% of the window, a main content area 50%, and we have two sidebars at 20% each, but we have 5% of padding. Okay, so that all equals to 90. Now the width of this is going to change if we minimize the browser a little bit, but without media queries we're not going to be able to move these sidebars. It's going to be squished in there, all three rows. So that's where media queries come in, which we'll talk about in a second. So flexible images or media, so even videos, maybe YouTube embedded videos, we want to use flexible images so they scale down and they do not go outside of the container. So use percentages when sizing images. Use different percentages depending on screen size. A lot of the times we'll just leave the images at a max width of 100%, and this will keep them from leaving their container. They'll be the size of 100% of their containing element. Okay, so media queries are definitely the most crucial aspect, the most important thing in creating a responsive website. What we do is use the media attribute to allow different styles or different style sheets altogether depending on the screen size. And this allows the presentation of content to be tailored to a specific range of output devices without having to change the content itself. And media queries can be either inline inside a style sheet, or we can actually point to certain external style sheets depending on the device or the width. So let's take a look at the media attribute in general, not specifically media queries, because the media attribute has been around for a while. It was used mostly for screen views, which is obviously on a monitor, on a website, and then print views. So that would be if you printed out something from the website. So you could have a different layout depending on if it was on your screen or if it was printed out. Some others included Braille, handheld, projection, and TV. So those are some other values for the media attribute that weren't too popular but could be used. So using the media rule with media queries for screen size is relatively new, and that was released after CSS3 was released. Alright, so let's take a look at using media queries with external style sheets. So this first one is just a link to a style sheet called style.css, and we're setting the media attribute to screen. Okay, so this line we could have used for a long time now. as long as the media attribute has been released. Here we're using a media query, so for our media attribute we have only screen, so this is only for computer screens or device screens, sorry, and a minimum width of 320 pixels and a maximum width of 568 pixels. If your screen is in the range of 320 and 568, then mobile.css is going to be loaded. If it's not, mobile CSS will be overlooked. And here we have, and this here is typically for a smartphone, 320 to 568. Here we have 768 to 980, which is typically for tablets. So in this line here, we're saying that if the screen is 768 to 980, then we want to load tablet.css. Alright, so these can't be loaded together, these two, because we have separate ranges. Alright, so now let's take a look at some inline media query syntax. What we need to do is inside, let's say we're in a style sheet called style CSS or whatever. We could use this media tag here, and we could set a max width of 600 pixels, so whatever we put in between here will only show up if the window is under 600 pixels, because that's the max width. Here we have a minimum width of 700 pixels, so anything that goes here will not show up if the window is less than 700 pixels wide. So these two here, we're not using ranges really. Well, we are, but we're not using two different numbers. Here we're saying 320 pixels to 568, which is the same as what we just looked at, except this is done inline as opposed to pointing to a separate style sheet. Same thing here, this would be for tablet devices. Anything between 768 and 980 will go here. Alright, so CSS transitions. CSS3 has some really nice transition and animation features, but by default, if we're using a responsive layout and we hit a media query breakpoint, which would be any of these, so if we went from 568 to 569, then that's a breakpoint. So if we hit breakpoints, by default the new layout just pops into view. However, we can use CSS transitions to have a smooth transition to the new layout. And as an example, let's say that we have a main column and a left column. When resized to a tablet width, the sidebar will go under the main column, and the main column stretches across the screen. Well, we can make the main column smoothly animate to a wider width just by using the following. So whatever the element is, we can just add the transition property and set the width to, and this is the duration that the transition will take, which is 2 seconds. Alright, so we'll have a smooth width transition that lasts 2 seconds. And we'll see this later on when we create our project. So that's it for the main components. Of course, there are other things to consider in responsive web design, but those three you should really get a good foundation in. Alright, so that's it for this section. In the next section we'll be talking about different tools that we can use for different situations in responsive web design.